properly. So I want to welcome you to another edition of AI Insiders. We've got a very special guest today with Kate ONeill, a friend and an accomplished author and speaker and all kinds of things. And Kate, I'll let you properly introduce yourself. But with her new book that's just come out on that gets into it talks a lot about humanity. But there's nowadays you can't have a point of view on how to engender humanity and make us more human without having a lot to say about where AI is going. And I think it has implications for us all. And Kate's already written about these aspects as well. So, Kate, I'd love for you to go and set this up more properly and introduce yourself to the Marketers Guild community for those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting you just yet.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And hi, everybody. I'm particularly intrigued with Jim Conley's cat in the frame there. Thanks for bringing a cat to the party. It's always always a welcome guest. If anyone else has any animals lurking in their workspace, do make sure that they show up on screen at some point.
We'll see if my two make an
Bonita.
appearance, but
Bonita.
with my daughter home today, I think they've got the better deal out with her. So they like
Fair
her
enough.
home.
She's a rescue from Bridgeport, and she's a badass.
Oh,
All
wow.
right.
She's a little thing, and she came in and just took everything over.
Aw, that's
Minor
great.
rescues from Oklahoma.
Ah,
Wow. A lot of rescues. I'm so glad to hear it. Well, I'm so pleased to be here with you today. I sent a little oh, there you go, a little request over to
Yeah.
David to let me share a screen, and I'm gonna do that. But before I do, I just want to say howdy and just kind of get a feel for you guys are this is like an hour, right? That we're all in conference with one another. And I thought that I would take about 10 minutes or so and sort of set the stage, give some overview as to this book that just came out today, by the way. Yay. That's
bravo.
today. It just launched, Pub Day. Yay. So I thought I would give you just the ideas and the frameworks in it at a broad level, kind of how they're discussed within the book. And then we could take some time to unpack what that means for marketers and from an AI for marketing specifically framework. So David, if you don't mind being the interviewer in our fireside chat component to that part of the discussion.
But by all means, and Kate, as I mentioned, like this group and just seeing like a lot of the regulars, at least who are here today, this is a very participatory group. If you haven't joined us yet, then by all means, we like interruptions, we like questions in chat. You can be on or off camera if you have a question, but or a comment or follow on, and it's just this is like I mean, it's really this is the best way that for most members to really build connections with each other, and so I love having that forum. So yes, I'll ask as many questions as there's time for, but
all right.
Curious to hear what everyone else thinks. So.
Good deal. Yeah. And I'd love to have your questions, interruptions, thoughts, whatever throughout. So let me go ahead and share if this is a good time to get started. Please. All right. Let me cue this up. Sorry. It's always like you have to have started your slideshow before you start your screen share. Zoom is very particular.
I do like that mix of like the very like heavy duty studio there, but a very warm background, and I think it's a nice like kind of yin and yang.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that folks who use a blurred background or a fake background, you have your reasons and all, and I think it makes total sense for some folks. For me, I just love having a glimpse into my real space for folks, so that you kind of get a feel for who I am and where I am. But I am incidentally in New York City in near Columbus Circle in what is the north end of Hell's Kitchen. So I live on 57th Street, and people who live in Hell's Kitchen proper would disagree and say that that is not Hell's Kitchen, in fact. that is, I don't know what they would call it, but we're not quite Upper West Side yet where we are. It's really just its own little animal. It's fun to say I live on Billionaires Row, but I'm on the Hundredaires side of the street. So it's more like that. Happy to see you all, meet you all. I'm really so pleased with, I couldn't be prouder of this book. I hope that everybody gets a chance to look into it. What I am and what my background is I have been known for quite some years as the tech humanist. And that is a result of the work I've been doing for really 30 years now in technology. And in every context, every environment I've ever worked in, I've been the person who's most concerned with or thinking about the user experience, the customer experience, the guest or student or learner or patient experience, whatever context people are in whatever environment we're talking about. And so, that culminated over the last decade and a half into a book I wrote 2 books ago called Tech Humanist. And that's been it's really been a game changer for the discourse around the way that technology impacts the human experience. And of course, as marketers and people working around AI, very well that those are incredibly important facets to the discussion. So it's always really wonderful when people who are leaders are really interested in that conversation. And that's one of the things that drove this book, is that as primarily a keynote speaker, that's the work I do now is a research I write and I consult and advise leaders of companies. But I'd say 90% or more of my revenue comes from keynote speaking. And I really enjoy it. I think it's a great way to get a message out to a large number of people in a transformative way that's memorable. And it feels like it makes a difference. But one of the things that's really particularly interesting about it is that you get a chance, as many of you who are speakers probably know, to field questions, right? As we're going to do today. And over time, the questions that you hear evolve, they change, and they take on sort of different themes. And one of the things that I noticed over the last few years has been that there's this theme of everything is changing too fast. Everyone has this sense that technology is changing too fast. The environment around technology is changing too fast. Even the business landscape, the geopolitics, everything just feels like it's moving so fast. And what this means for leaders who make up a lot of the audiences that I speak to, they feel really hamstrung by the decisions that they need to make. And they feel like the consequences are so vast to these decisions, and the factors that need to be taken into consideration are just so complex, and they're having a very difficult time with that. So one of the things that I have found in my research is that there's 2 ways that this can go wrong in the ways that it gets approached, and they kind of make up 2 opposite approaches, or 2 flavors of future ready flaws, as I call it here. And that's either sacrificing the future for the present or sacrificing the present for the future. And one is about being hesitant, knowing that there's something that you should be doing, but feeling like you're not ready, you don't have enough data, you don't have enough commitment, you don't know enough about the situation. And so you're allowing hesitancy to drive that decision. And then the opposite side of that is often what we see exhibited in Silicon Valley and many of the, frontier model AI companies, is this model of impatience and really being about how do we get the fastest implementation of whatever we can do. We feel like the slower we go, or if we take any time at all to consider that we're going to miss the market. So this is about acceleration at its most accelerated, really. And you'll see in a moment in the sort of the 3rd or 4th row in this table where it talks about the risks. I characterize those as the harms of inaction and the harms of action. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But what actually then ends up happening is that even when you are taking an accelerationist approach to your decision making, in regardless of how you approach it, I find that most leaders feel, and I ask this in almost every room and almost every hand goes up, how many of you feel like the future is looking pretty uncertain? Right? Yeah. I'd say most hands here would probably go up as well. And it is, and that's fair. I'm not trying to invalidate your feelings. But what I try to do within the framework of this book is provide some models for making better sense of the future and trying to contextualize the decision making that we need to do so that it doesn't feel quite so daunting. And so that uncertainty is not a barrier to making the needed decisions that need to happen. And so that uncertainty is just enough of a warning to folks who might be moving too fast and moving beyond our understanding. So it's balancing both of those considerations that need to happen. So let me back up one step and just talk about why decision making is critical, why this is a really important topic within the larger discussion. It is the fact that when we talk about technology and we're making decisions that play, around AI and data and algorithmic optimization, that we're dealing with scale and scope and implications that affect all of us. We're all affected every day by technology and those kinds of decisions. We are all also navigating this tension between that immediate action and the delayed action and the harms of action and harms of inaction. Let me give you a quick example of what that looks like. So when we think about the climate crisis, it is pretty much the case. I think we most of us would agree there's just about no action that we could take today that would seem in 10 years like we were too hasty in making that move. We need to be moving quickly, and we're not moving quickly enough in many cases. There's harms of inaction in play there because the necessary things, the necessary steps are not necessarily being taken. And then when it comes to the frontier model AI space, there's a polar opposite example. We have companies rushing ahead and putting in place, government facing, for example, or sort of law enforcement facing implementations of these types of tools and frameworks. And we're not ready. We're not ready for what the social implications of that are likely to be. We're barely having sophisticated enough discourse about those topics within the technology critic and analyst space. So those are sort of the two framing examples. But in general, I think we can understand that when we're thinking about especially technology decisions, those benefit by being centered around humanity. This is my thesis, is that the more centered around humanity they are, the more we stand to make our businesses better while making the human experience better. And then this concept of future readiness is my answer to the notion of future proof is one that I find to be a little off. Like, we can't be future proof. You can't proof against the future, but what you can be is more or less future ready. And so what this book tries to do is put into place some models for you to understand how to prepare for the future. And so that all of that comes together into contextual understanding that leaders are spending 40% of their time making decisions, and many of them don't feel like they're making the decisions effectively. So that's a pretty hefty amount of wrong-headed use of time and some misdirection that's happening out there. So here's how I'm attempting to solve this. And I think that this is going to be a model that helps put some clarity around this for you, for everyone, for your clients, potentially. When we think about what we have already done in the past, what's behind us, we can look at the decisions we've already made and the priorities we've already committed to and so on as what mattered in the past. And that is what's known. We know that. We have that as concrete, knowable kinds of data. And I say knowable because as we move closer to the present, we may not have that data yet. We may not have the reports or the analysis yet, but those are all gettable, right? Like, we can usually run a report or do the analysis to find out anything that if we stand in this moment and look from this moment back, we can usually find out what quantifies the decisions we've made so far. But as we look forward, one of the reasons that the future feels uncertain is because it gets hazy, right? We don't necessarily have the data. We don't have the guide to what we can know about the future. We barely can predict, right? Unless we're very good at it, unless we have a lot of practice and skill. Predictions are notoriously spotty. So what we need is a model that actually helps us think about the long range future, but that we can pull back into helping us make the next step. So we look ahead and figure out, what could we predict about the future? What might matter in the future? What is possibly going to be a priority that we might look at? And then how do we think about what we would need to do next in order to accomplish what we think might matter? And one fun example of this I'll share is from my background. I was one of the first 100 employees at Netflix. This was an incredibly fun and potent foundational experience for me in 99, 2000, 2001 timeframe. And as you might recall, there was a pretty large company who dominated that video rental space at the time, and it wasn't Netflix. So I happen to have right here this little prop, as you may recall that logo. It was in that time when Blockbuster was the dominant player in the space and Netflix was a real upstart company, that Reed Hastings and the other executives at the company committed money and resources to research and development toward what we were then calling set-top boxes, which was the predecessor to streaming as we now know it. And this is in, again, 2000 or so, 2001. Netflix didn't have a dedicated streaming plan until 2007. And Roku didn't come out as a standalone player until 2006. So, I mean, this is 5, 6, 7 years ahead that these decisions are being made while you're the upstart player in a market dominated by an 800-pound gorilla. So I think of that as an example of being able to look ahead and say, what is likely to matter? If we come out victorious over these next few battles, what would we want? How would we want to be positioned? And so how could we make decisions with that trajectory in mind, knowing that we don't need to make the ultimate decisions now. We don't necessarily need to solve the long range problems today, but we do need to make tomorrow's decisions and the decisions right in front of us in such a way that we allow the possibility of getting to that long range place. Does that make sense? Okay. What I think the ultimate goal here for me anyway, and this is where the tech humanist concept comes back into play, is I think when we think about what we're trying to facilitate, it's really thinking about business objectives, what we're all trying to do in business, and then the human outcomes we'd like to see, what we think are possible, along with technological capabilities. And so instead of using technological capabilities simply to amplify business objectives, we're looking for that overlap between what the business is trying to do and what people are trying to do. And this is where you, as marketers, you really come into play here because you have a better handle on this than most people. So really thinking about that as a three-way relationship, or at least as a two-way relationship between business and humanity, and human experience, using technology to amplify that alignment as opposed to simply amplifying the business objectives. That's how we get to the purposeful, meaningful human experiences at scale that I believe we really have the possibility of doing. One last model here, so second to last model, I think, real quick. And don't let this be daunting to you. This is it's going to make a lot of sense in a second here. What I've done here is talk about this model called Throughline thinking. And this is really trying to help think about from the past through the present to the future. How do we put together the skills that we need to make sense of what we already know and what we can predict? And so what we can break this down into is analytical skills and generative skills. And so you can see that top row of skills is all analytical. It's learning, knowledge, understanding. We're all familiar with these skills. What this offers us is the ability to take the data we observe, the patterns we can recognize, use our sense-making abilities, and our ability to foster meaningful insights and put that all together in a way that we actually can make foster some instincts and insights around that to make more future-ready decisions. What's really powerful, though, is that when we think about that in combination with generative skills, and we often are thinking these days when we hear the word generative, it triggers the thought of generative AI, but there's really little more powerful than the generative skills as demonstrated by humans. So empathy, creativity, and imagination are those three that we're talking about. And you can see how together with the analytical skills, these really bring so much strength. So when you're thinking about creativity as a bridge between analytical data and innovative solutions, you all know this. This is a very marketing relevant kind of skill set. Empathy, of course, something we're all very familiar with, and imagination is really powerful in being able to actually think about those long range possibilities and imagine how data driven decisions could play out and what the most meaningful path forward looks like. So combining those sets of skills is really where we make those future ready decisions. And one more, this is what I said, the second to last was the previous messy diagram. This is the last messy diagram. And then I'd love to take some interaction with you. When we take that now next continuum and really zoom in on that, the last part of it, you may be familiar with this concept of forecast scenario planning, that type of thing. But one of the ways that we can think about thinking about the future is that if we ask questions about, what's likely to matter, what are we likely to see happen in our space if we're working in a particular industry, what kinds of changes are happening. We could usually, these gray arrows represent outcomes, possible outcomes. We can think about lots and lots of possible outcomes, ways that things could play out, right? But what I think is really important here is to look at those blue and black arrow or labels. One of these possible outcomes is most likely the most probable outcome. When you think objectively about your space, you can probably identify what the most probable outcome in any given scenario is. And you probably have a preferred future outcome. You probably have some way that you want things to go that's probably different from the most probable way that it needs to go. And so the big question is this: how do you recognize, what can you do to close the gap between the probable outcome and the preferred future? And the more clearly you can hone in on this and articulate this and really come up with the next actions that you need to take, next decisions you need to make, and how you can prioritize your time and your resources to move in this direction. Genuinely, I think this is $1 million question in almost any environment. It will really move the needle on the clarity of your future readiness activity. So that's the gist. It's a very quick overview. I hope that was helpful. And there's a QR code right there if anybody wants to pick up the book. I know you also put it in the chat, David. So would love your support and help spreading the word today, especially. I'm going to hit stop share and see some questions starting to form.
Well, that's great. I want to ask one to kind of tee things up, and then Adam, I'll go to you because I'm going to be a little selfish today. But if we look at the week and month in which we're having this conversation right now, and then the place, which is very important to this, there are some very different views about humanity, and it is hard to avoid discussion of politics around this. Even there are some who look at DEI and see inclusiveness as a wonderful thing, right? There's some who look at DEI and see this as a form of discrimination. There are some who see a much more collaborative version of humanity, as some to aspire to, but that could be, perceived as naive by others. There's some, like the world's richest person, who wants to create means to even escape this planet, while others like Ray Kurzweil have talked about just the melding of humanity and machines. And this is, I have to check the original sources to see how much this is preferred versus just inevitable. But there are a lot of big differences out there, and so how do we even have a discussion in terms of like defining humanity at a time when, for most of us on this call, would probably say it's the most polarizing time we've seen in our lifetimes?
Yeah, thank you. It's such an important and great question. And it's one that's very relevant because, to your point, I have spent the last week and a half on nothing but media interviews, in support of the book, but also answering questions about, the overturning of the AI executive order and, 2 weeks ago, Meta backtracking on the or changing up its approach to content community notes and content moderation and so on. So, there's just been a lot over the last couple of
Yeah.
weeks as it relates to this space and as it relates to everything. So yes, it is a really polarizing time as it relates to values and the way that we think about humanity. I think that above all, what we're in need of is frameworks and vocabulary to even begin having a conversation with each other. You just can't hope to make any progress in any of this without wading into that water and saying, all right, look, I know this is going to be hard, but here's what I'm offering as a way we can begin to talk about the harms of action and the harms of inaction, or about what our priorities are and how we imagine the world might look and what we might want the world to look like. And if we disagree, we disagree. But I think that there's some value in at least putting stakes in the ground and saying, look, I think it doesn't do us any good to be ambiguous about this.
Mhm.
It doesn't do us any good to not have our terms defined and be kind of fumbling around in the dark and hoping that we get something that just moves people emotionally when we don't have the right model for it. So in a world where as that was my trailer speak, in a world where there's going to be differences about DE and I and about leaving the planet. I think that those of us who want to see a more inclusive approach to everything really have the opportunity to explain why, to put into some kind of compelling, sort of meta marketing, a compelling approach to what benefit that has. And I think that we can't hope to create human centric technology or make human centric technology decisions without characterizing what it is we think humanity is
Mhm.
and what's good about it. So in my view, what's good about humanity is we're meaning seekers
Mhm.
and we're all about what matters. Meaning at every level is all about what matters. And so to be able to even have the conversation with someone who may potentially disagree with you, you have to get clear on what matters to you and what matters to them. This is the beginning of that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important because I mean, it is a time where there's even debate in terms of like how human someone is, right? Is someone who
Mhm.
came to this country illegally, are they an illegal, right? Like almost like an object,
Mhm.
and with that, just by default, a criminal because doing something illegal makes you a criminal, whether violent or not, versus are you an immigrant, a contributor to society, a part of the fabric of your schools and offices and everything else that churches and all those things that make one human, right? They're your neighbor, right? But I don't want to get too sidetracked. I'd love to hear what Adam has in mind and what the
Yeah,
rest of you have to say.
thanks. Thanks, Dave. Kate, this is really good, very
Thank
thoughtful.
you.
I was I was about to have Dave's insightful questions derail my question, but I think I'm actually going to stick with it,
Good.
and maybe tie it back at the end. Um, because actually, maybe I wasn't listening clearly enough to you. I took a little bit more away from what you were talking about, more about the frameworks that we should think about using and less about value judgments, um, of choice of outcomes and things like that. But David, you do bring up a really good point. I'm going to come back to in a second. Um, I wanted to ask you why you feel like you need to write this now. And I'm curious about the sort of general question of it. But in my mind, you're either feeling like secular trends, exigent circumstances of our lives as people, as citizens, as professionals, like something's like leading up to it, or you feel like because the future is so uncertain, et cetera, it calls for it. And so but I did want to ask that kind of thought-provoking question of like why you feel like this needs to be written now. And then I think I potentially have a quick follow-up that
yeah, I'll welcome that follow-up, but I'd love to respond to that question because I think it's a really generous question of you to ask and a really meaningful one for me to share. I had the previous book to this is called A Future So Bright. And it is often misquoted as The Future is Bright. And that is not the title of the book. It is very specifically A Future So Bright, which is the implied completion of that title is a future that could be so bright if we make the right decisions. And there's a lot of coverage in there about AI and emerging technologies. It is really a discussion about how many different ways we could apply the resources that we have, including AI and technology, to solving the problems that plague humanity and be in a better place, in addition to solving business challenges. So all of these books, the last 4 books I've written have all been business and technology books, and they all sort of share this premise that not just do well by doing good, but sort of you're going to find an easier time of growth and scaling if you align with what your
techno-optimist
constituencies. It's not techno-optimism, actually. I'm going to correct you very specifically on that
term, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, and very specifically, I go out and lay that out very clearly in both this book and the last book, because techno-optimism is a term that Mark Andreessen and the folks who are in his school cling to, and that suggests that we should be accelerationist. We should be adopting every technology to its fullest extent. Tech can solve every problem. My approach is tech humanist, and it is strategically optimistic. It is to say, if we are human centric, and if we use these tools well and make the right decisions, put the right guardrails in place, then we stand to make the future brighter for many, many people. And so my goal is how to make the best futures for the most people with every decision that we make. So yes, it is the moment that we're in. We're in a moment where I think the accelerationist discourse is so loud, and it is so it feels to many leaders like it's the only call, like it's the only model that they can follow. And I want there to be another model for leaders.
So I think that's one of the real core reasons for having either a book like this or a discussion like this. And Dave, I agree with a lot of your assumptions that were behind your question, but I think I would actually beg to differ that like what's really happening is there is this forcing function around our attention and how it's being siloed, balkanized, twisted, amplified across social media or ripped out of nuance. And, it sounds all lovey-dovey to say, oh, we all want the same thing, just different ways to think about it. I just sort of feel like that core idea has become even further removed to the point where we kind of absorb, alternative facts or different facts or sort of interpret things differently. And I'm very colored by Chris Hayes's book that he has around the attention economy coming out. And I just feel like he, along with some other people, have felt like this revolution is brewing, or there's kind of this huge backlash that's coming. And it's not just Jonathan Haidt, teenagers are being caught up in it. It's like we're all really frustrated by this. And he goes so far as to map it against, look at labor, the restrictions on work hours. Like he said, why, he wasn't predicting anything, but he said, why shouldn't there be a restriction on the number of hours you're using devices in a day or platforms or something? But I just kind of wanted to throw that back into the mix, back to Dave's question, because I do feel like independent of value judgments or disagreements on the value of humanity tied to certain outcomes, there are frameworks that we need to be using that are separated from the swirl and the warping of our attention economy. So thanks for
thanks, Adam. Yeah, I think it's just also like where where some of the value judgments come in are like, well, yeah, I spend a lot of time like thinking, talk about tech, but I want to work with people who, on a fundamental level, believe humanity matters. And so it's like, presumably only someone like that is going to read Kate's book in the first place.
Right.
I think it's like a low bar that doesn't have to be co-opted by any part of the political or ideological spectrum, but it's like it is still a ticket to entry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are some great questions coming in. I want to go to Jim's comment, and then Alexander, I want to make sure you're heard too. But Jim has a great comment in the chat, not just because he and Bonita will be reading the book soon. But Jim, do you want to just share it live since you're on camera?
Yeah, I can just read it. I like that slide a few back, the now next continuum. And it seems your work challenges marketers to think beyond immediate AI. I didn't think I'd be reading it. Capabilities and considering both probable outcomes and preferred futures. This is risk management and risk mitigation 101, right? So, I mean, having worked with David for many years, I mean, not officially, I've turned into like AI first, okay? So within the now next continuum framework, you presented this a few, you have this balance between the urgency of adoption with the ethical imperative to mitigate long-term harms. Do you know Rob Tersick?
Mm-mm.
He focuses on this as well. I'll send you something through LinkedIn.
Thank you.
Because, we'll get to that later. Specifically, what are the most underestimated risks of both action and inaction when it comes to human-centered AI decision-making? You just touched on it, but I think that's really core.
Yeah, thank you. No, this is a really thoughtful question, like a really well-framed question. I think one of the things I think is really important to point out here is that one of the ways that I use this what matters nomenclature from the title is, as I mentioned earlier, I think that one of the most fundamental, and I've yet to be presented with a counter view that convinces me that one of the most fundamental human characteristics is meaning making, that we're meaning makers and meaning seekers. And that fundamentally, I'm a linguist by education, so I always come at this from the standpoint of semantics and how we try to communicate in language, but there's also patterns and truth and purpose and significance and relevance and all of the ways that we form meaning at all these different levels, all the way out to the most macro, big picture, what's it all about and why are we here, kind of a cosmic and existential meaning. And at every level that we talk about meaning, what we're talking about is what matters. But what I think we don't talk about often enough is that innovation could really be framed as about what matters next or what is going to matter. And that opportunity is a way to get away from the haste and waste of innovation and really focus on what good it can do, not necessarily in a nonprofit or humanitarian sense, although I think aligning with those opportunities is an incredibly powerful opportunity. That's a little redundant. Sorry. Aligning with I advocate for aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, and using that as a roadmap for ethical innovation and ethical acceleration. But the other thing that I think we miss a lot of the time is that we conflate the topics of transformation and innovation. So transformation, I think, is inherently a catch-up activity. It is about getting up to the moment we're currently in, catching up to what is already happening in the marketplace, what your competitors are doing, what the market expects of you, what customers expect of you, and so on. Innovation is the part where we're actually looking forward and trying to find a moat, right? Trying to create some new way that we want the world to go, and we want to be the leaders in that space. Those are two very different sets of questions and two very different frameworks, and this book makes it very clear, it disambiguates those. So it plots it along as well, along the now next continuum, to make sure that when we're thinking about what's known and what's knowable, that's the transformation side of the conversation. And when we're talking about questions, insights, adaptation, and what is partly predictable, that's the innovation side of the conversation. It also puts the harms of inaction and the harms of action along that now next continuum. So we're layering a lot of things together, but what we're saying is there's an ethical conundrum where if you know that there's a transformation imperative that you should catch up because the rest of the world understands that we should be more energy efficient, that we should be, making decisions that are more inclusive, that you should be making sure that you have accessibility built into your mobile platform or whatever. That's transformation, and not acting on it is invoking the harms of inaction. And if we look toward the opportunity space in the innovation world, then what we're looking at is the harms of action that go concurrently with that. So if we move too quickly and we haven't considered the real world scenarios of algorithmic bias and the ways that AI can go wrong and that tech-led decisions can go wrong, we are going to be making some pretty powerfully wrong decisions. So those are the two that's the kind of tipping point of the whole model coming together and layering up. It's a lot to unpack in a short amount of time, but that's why there's a pretty good amount of pages to get through here. But I appreciate the nuance of the question, and I hope that it feels like that's the direction that the answer lies in. And I'd love to hear, once you said you ordered the book, once you've had a chance to look it over, if you have further questions and thoughts around the discussion. I'd love to hear them.
Sure. No, I need to sit a bit with that now next continuum slide. I think I need to unpack that a little bit. Some of what you just said was interesting. It was very Yoda-ish. To not, it's clearly you're very enthusiastic about this, but to not do is to do, but to do, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot to keep in your head when you're just talking. It's nice to have the diagrams in front of you. Gene, glad you were here. Thanks for being here.
And then, Chris, before we go to you, Alexander, did you still have a question or comment?
Yeah. It's a little more specific, I guess, but do you have, we've talked a little bit about, it sounds like corporate examples or various examples who aren't doing this. Do you have examples that you've come across that you feel that are actually employing this or doing this successfully?
Yeah, there's one thing that's really fun in the book is I did do a lot of research and interviewing and pulled together a lot of case studies. I have examples in there from Ørsted, a Danish company that's in the energy space, in the shipping and energy space. They did some incredibly powerful transformation and innovation work over the last few decades, and there's some good breakdown of that. There's also Levi Strauss in there. They've done some really powerful work around their e-commerce positioning and how to make sure that they were ready for the COVID moment and beyond. So some interesting stuff there. There's some good and bad examples from Apple, from Amazon, from a number of other companies that are, large behemoth companies. And Google, for example, and Google is a former client of mine, so it's always very dicey to kind of wade into those territories. But it's really important, I think, to recognize what they have done well and where they have opportunity to do better. But yeah, there's some really great examples of those, and mostly what it comes down to is, nobody's making flawless decisions, right? Nobody is navigating the space so cleanly and coming away like, oh, we're perfect. Give us the awards, give us all the awards. It's more like there's a really great example of how they figured out that they should be thinking about one facet of human experience in taking into consideration how they implemented a thing. Like Amazon figured out that their their applicant tracking system, and as you're probably familiar with this example of the AI review of resumes that was favoring male candidates and favoring candidates that were less diverse. And they figured that out. They tried very hard to kind of course correct it with synthetic data injections, with a bunch of different kind of tweaks to the algorithm. And they just found that they were not really able to correct many of the underlying biases that came from biased data sets and just kind of in general, the algorithmic model being kind of flawed. So they still use it internally. They still use it kind of in very limited specific ways. but it's not a product that they're going to allow to be associated with the quality of what they're hoping their reputation is about. So, it's decisions like that, like struggling with the very real world of, trying to use these emerging technologies in real world kind of scenarios yields difficult results. And you have to make the decision as to whether it's something that you want to stand behind, or if you can fix it, or if it's just going to be something that you're continually trying to improve. And there's a lot of varied examples of that throughout the book. You probably all have many examples that you've witnessed throughout your careers that run the gamut of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I would just add that it seems like, in my experience, at least what observation, in both in terms of what I've worked on, many times there's a lot of great intentions, a lot of kind of what you've described, but not so formally done. But like, some of that ethos kind of injected into it, except at the end, the decision usually comes down to financials. And then it's that kind of, it makes the decision. That's like, all things being equal, sure, we could do that. But, this is X plus, we're going to go with that. So,
yeah. And Alexander, that's totally valid. And I think that one of the reasons, in my experience as an advisor and consultant, one of the reasons why the decision often comes down to financials is because there isn't a rigorous, disciplined framework on the other side of financials. There isn't something to be able to quantify or point to that says, we're not just making a decision that runs counter to financials because it feels good to do that. We're making that decision because we can characterize that decision as being wrong-headed in this particular way. And I've found that actually does help change the direction of that decision making.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks for that. Chris, good to see
Kate,
you.
I love sorry, go ahead, David.
Oh, just good to see you twice today. So
yeah, no doubt. Ironically, Dave and I were talking a bit about this earlier, Kate. So this will his ears will perk up when I mention this. But love the format and the thinking.
Thank you.
I'm curious in the book, and maybe this is just go read the book and I'll find this out. But I'm sure if you could tell us a little bit about how you either inform or suggest that this replace what other people, what organizations are doing. Because one of the things I see a lot with methodologies, it becomes and instead of or. And like, how do you inject that into where does that fit in the decision-making process, and how does it help cure some of the things that get in the way and are frankly habitual? And, the finance one's a good one, right? The habit around what a P&L looks like is just so broken. And being gap compliance more important than actually seeing the truth, right? But how do you unlearn to learn? And to talk a little bit about the context of way you guide people to use this in their thinking stack, I guess, is the way to think about it.
Yeah, so I think the work around scenario planning and forecasting, many of us have been doing this for a long time and are familiar with it as I think Jim was the one who said it's sort of scenario planning 101 or that sort of thing. We're all familiar with some of these tools, but we haven't used the tools in the context of this larger model or this larger approach. I find that the decision making, all of the new work I've done around decision making in this that I didn't really get into here. I cannot wait for you to see it, because it has to do with insights and foresights, and that's been the backbone of the work that I've done for the last decade and a half. There's a way in which that kind of approach facilitates faster, more future-ready decision making than anything we could do with data or algorithmic decision making, but that actually starts to coalesce around culture and brand and experience in ways that are palpable, that in ways that really accelerate the decision making processes. That coupled with the ability to do this kind of close the gap, preferred and probable outcomes, to have the ability to model this out, sort of demonstrate that we're not making a gut-based decision. We have, even if we don't have quantitative data to be able to say why this is going to be harmful or why we need to pump the brakes a little bit on this decision. We have a model that shows the roadmap we're trying to follow. And one of the outcomes that happens through this decision-making process is what I call bankable foresights. So it isn't just about, asking good questions and trying to make your best call. It's about really following this rigorous process to come to a set of approaches that are insights informed and that have as their outcome a set of bankable foresights that we set in place, just like that Netflix example, and say, look, we don't have to build everything today, but whatever we do create should harmonize with what we think this future looks like. And if we don't harmonize with that future, then we're costing ourselves more in the long run. We're costing ourselves in terms of the labor it's going to take, the effort it's going to take, the goodwill we're going to burn along the way, and so on. We have a model to be able to explain all of that. That conversation happens a lot more easily in a boardroom than a conversation that says, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. So I think that what it replaces, to your point, is a lot of more esoteric thinking and a lot of more sort of feeling around in the dark and trying to justify decisions that are not informed by a rigorous enough thought process. So hopefully this will be that. And I look forward to feedback from the rest of you. I'm looking at this comment here from Emily too. Emily, are you still here? Did you want to raise this in person?
Hey, yes, I'm still here. I'm actually getting ready to go to work soon, but I really appreciate this conversation. I feel like I'm meeting more people who are in line with the values that I've always held on to since I was a child. So it's really nice to be a part of this.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
Emily.
you.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's a great comment to wrap. And I do hope others wind up reading the book and that you get to connect with Kate now that you've been able to hear her take live. I mean, Kate is wonderful. I look forward to getting to dive in and reading all this myself and all the inspiration ahead. Just been a pleasure just following you and getting to connect and reconnect over the years, and I'll look forward to way more to come. So thanks for joining us here, Kate.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody for such a wonderful discussion too.
Terrific. Well, we'll come back sometime and we'll see how humanity progresses. So.
Fingers crossed.
All
okay.
Right.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.